right. Thanks for joining us today. We are excited to get started in the first of our Lunch and Learn Texas Hands and Voices webinar series. These webinars take place during the lunch hour from 12 to noon. This year's topics are centered around advocacy, and just wanted to let you know that these webinars are recorded and are accessible for later viewing via our YouTube channel. And we'll send that information out to you, and I'll put it here in the chat at the end of the webinar. Today we have Theresa Johnson joining us from the Rochester Institute of Technology, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf there. And she will be sharing not only some great pieces of information from her professional journey, but also from her personal journey as a mother of a child who is deaf, hard of hearing. So I would love to turn this over now to Theresa, and she can introduce herself and get this going. Theresa, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you being here and sharing your wisdom with everyone.
You are welcome. My pleasure. So I'll wait for her to get the PowerPoint up. Okay. Decide if I need my glasses or don't need my glasses. Probably I'll take them off and on a million times. Okay, so if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Like Michaela said, I work for the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which is one of 9 colleges of the Rochester Institute of Technology. Some of you have probably heard of NTID, and some of you maybe not. It is a 2-year program serving students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Students can attend NTID and obtain a 2-year degree. There are some certification programs where you can go and just go for the certification, and/or students who are interested in a 4-year degree or even a graduate degree can start at NTID and move on up to the RIT level and pursue, advanced studies. Some students even do both simultaneously. So there are lots of different situations that can be considered if students are interested in attending the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. But enough of that. Let me move on to who I am. I'm the parent of 2 girls, Joey Lynn and Amy Jade. As Michaela said, Amy is my deaf daughter. I adopted her from China. You can see a picture of her. This is actually within a couple of months of when I adopted her. So she was just about 6 when I got her. She had no language and had no schooling at all. So we were really starting from square one. Joey Lynn was my birth daughter. Joey was born hearing, but with lots of other physical disabilities, learning disabilities, was very medically fragile, and a few years ago passed away. So Joey's no longer with me. But I did walk through that transition path, go down that path of transition planning with both girls. So both of those experiences will sort of be embedded in what I have to say today. Like I said, I work at NTID and I wear a lot of hats, like we all do. If we're working, we all wear lots of hats at our jobs. I actually retired in 2020 after 40 years and had decided I was exhausted, I was done, and COVID hit and I was bored to tears. And before I knew it, I was back at work. During that 40 years, though, I spent about a third of it working in rehab, where I did everything from teach job readiness classes. I helped people find jobs and job coached on the job. I helped people who are deaf or hard of hearing get jobs and keep jobs. And I did a lot of employer development where I worked with employers all over the city of San Antonio, from landscapers to bankers, and developing job opportunities for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. And then I spent about a third of my career in higher ed. I, again, had multiple hats, but primarily was responsible for being the director of disability services for 5 colleges in the Atlanta area, as well as oversee the interpreter training program. And then lastly, I spent about a third of my career in the K through 12 arena, but always in sort of an outreach capacity and transition capacity. So worked a lot with public schools, colleges, employers, students, and doing everything from coordinating transition activities for students to providing transition training to teachers and counselors. So I've done a little bit of everything, but all of it focusing on older students. I've never worked with little ones. Folks focusing on older students and adults as it pertains to preparing for transition or going to college or obtaining employment. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So there are, let's see, I think there are 5 bullets there, 5 areas that I'm going to touch on today. And, forgive me if I'm talking fast. Interpreters, holler at me if I need to slow down a little bit, because I want to cover a lot of ground. Each one of these bullets could take an afternoon easily. Easily. So we're going to try to cover all 5 of them in sort of a broad stroke kind of way. And then if at some point you're interested in having more discussion about any one of these topics, let Michaela know, and maybe we can plan for something in the future where we can sit down and really drill down deeper into these areas. Next slide. So I'm going to start with what I have to watch myself because I tend to be a bit preachy in this area. So I apologize in advance, but I just feel so strongly about this. It is never too early. As parents, I think we tend to get so busy, right? We're so busy about the day, busy about getting everything done, busy about, taking care of what needs to be done in order to get our kids to school or get them to daycare, or, we're just busy. So oftentimes the whole concept of thinking about future and transition and getting ready for jobs, getting ready for college, whatever the future might hold, at most we usually will do things like, what do you want to do when you grow up? We're asking our little ones. And they're wanting to be princesses and firemen or whatever. So I think that it's really worthy of us to find time to think very intentionally about what do we need to do early on to prepare for later. So even as early as 2 to 4 years old, you babies, these are really little ones, you can be incorporating things into your day that will lead to transition skills down the road. And simply, things like making choices. And a simple idea or example, I guess, of that would be if you're providing your child with a snack, offering chips versus cookies, whatever. And instead of saying, well, you can have both or whatever, insisting that they make a choice. That seems silly and kind of simple, but it's beginning that process of having them understand that you have to kind of think about what is it you want most, and make a choice and stick with it. So those kinds of things can be incorporated early on and should be incorporated throughout their childhood. Learning how to advocate for self. Why are you crying? Why are you upset? Talk to me. Tell me what's going on. Express to me what it is you prefer, or what it is you're upset about, or what it is you want or don't want, so that I can help assist you. That again is very simple at 2 and 4, but becomes quite complicated, can be real complex at the ages of 16 or 18. But those are the same skill sets all the way through childhood. It's important that your children have chores, learning how to do a job and doing it right, not accepting lesser than. I have had parents say, well, I, expect more. I will ask my kids who are not deaf, who don't have disabilities, to do things that I don't necessarily ask the child who is deaf or has other disabilities. I am of the opinion that when we do that, we mean well. We might be just saying it's just easier. Let's just be honest. We're busy. It's just easier. But at the end of the day, what is the message that that student or that child is getting? The message is, I'm lesser than, I'm not capable of, I can get by with it, I can be manipulated. What lots of things that aren't really serving us well can be, sort of interpreted by us not expecting the same thing of all of our kids. So having chores, expecting something of them, timelines for getting something done, even considering community work, that can be working at your church, working at your, your wherever you do charity work, whatever it is, but having them become involved and expecting that they complete a task. And this can become more complicated and more complex as they get older. So at 12 or 16, of course, you're looking at possibly a little part-time job, maybe 2 or 3 hours a week. My daughter did everything from, at the age of 12, she was pulling weeds for the neighbors. My brother-in-law would have her wash his car and help with yard work. She would go with me on jobs. Sometimes I'd have to work weekends or evenings, and I was a single parent, so I took her with me, but I would give her tasks and pay her a little bit for them. So she was assisting. It could be organizing papers or setting up chairs or whatever, but it's work. It's that concept of working to earn some money, but also working and following instructions, completing the task, things that are important and, job skills for the future. By the age of 14 in Texas, that's the official age of transition in the public schools, and the transition IEP meetings should begin. A student should be leading those IEP meetings by the age of 14. And if not leading them, at least beginning to participate in them so that ultimately he or she can lead them. Looking at ways for them to participate in sports and clubs. That may sound like those are like extracurricular or fluffy things, but sports and clubs offer opportunity for students to learn how to work in a team, learn how to lead an activity, learn how to get along, learn how to maybe not be the winner, but be a good sport and support the others. There are lots, again, of skill sets that are really important that are learned in sports and club and extracurricular activities that will lead to what employers are looking for in a job. And of course, by the age of 16 to 20, really should be taking very seriously all of these strategies to include part-time or full-time work. By the age of 16, 17, he or she should begin to be, if they're going to college or they're going to a trade school or some kind of post-secondary educational opportunity, they should be exploring what those options might be. By the age of 16, he or she should know how to advocate for his rights. That doesn't mean going in and demanding and saying, I have the right for, and I demand X, Y, or Z, but knowing how to appropriately advocate for what he or she needs in any number of different settings. What a student might need in the classroom could be, as you know, very different than what a student might need on the ball field or in a group setting. And then understanding employer and college expectations. We hear often from employers and from college faculty and staff that students come to them very unaware of what the expectations will be, have no idea that they're not going to be spoon-fed everything, like oftentimes they are through, K through 12 and at home, because that's what we do as parents. I highlighted the pre-ETS programs, the STEM programs and summer programs, because I wanted to make sure that I remember to say to you, there are lots of activities that are available to your student locally, in your towns, statewide. We have, of course, the Texas School for the Deaf offers summer programs or other summer camps that are offered statewide for deaf students. And then, of course, nationally, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf offers a very wide range pre-transition and STEM programs to prepare students for transitioning onto employment. And these programs are offered for kids in the middle school range as well as high school. I encourage you to really look at considering any and all of these. I sent my daughter to everything I could possibly send her to. And sometimes there'd be a program that I wouldn't be able to afford, but I would look for what money. VR counselors oftentimes have money to send kids. VR counselors, by the way, have funding for pre-transition activities now. That used to not be a thing, but oftentimes they can send a 14-year-old to a transition related or transition preparation related camp or activity and pay for the cost of that. So look for those kinds of things. Sometimes your school district has funding for those things. Also civic organizations. Sertoma Club is great for supporting deaf students. Quota Club is another civic organization that is really big at supporting deaf students. So, don't be shy about looking for funding out there that will pay for camps and, transition programs that will be designed specifically for students who are deaf or hard of hearing and their preparation to transition on after high school. Next slide, please. So talk a little bit about IDEA from a transition perspective. The IDEA is public school law, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And public schools, that's their law. That's the law they have to comply with in order to provide services for your student while they're attending public school as a student with a disability. So under the ADEA, every student has the right to lead and participate in their IEP transition meetings. I just mentioned a minute ago how important it was at the age of 14, if not before. My daughter started going to her IEP meetings in the first grade, went to every single IEP meeting she ever had. She was always there. And by the 8th grade was leading her transition meetings. So the earlier you start, the better. That means that earlier they are at a place where they're understanding what's going on and what the meetings are for. And the earlier they feel comfortable and confident enough to begin having a voice in those meetings. Really, really important. And transition law says that students have the right, and actually schools should expect those students to lead and or participate. And I say and or because I recognize some students maybe are not cognitively at a level where they're able to assume full leadership in those meetings, but there are lots of creative ways for them to have a voice. I have seen picture boards made. I've seen PowerPoints created. I've seen photos shared of various things that a student likes, dislikes, that they've shared with transition teams. But the beauty of a student having a role in that meeting is the transition team, which is comprised primarily of education professionals, are looking at the student. They're paying attention to the student. When my daughter had her first transition meeting where she was leading, I was shocked at the difference. All of a sudden, all those people around the table who are looking down, filling out papers, there's just lots of paper shuffling and lots of doing whatever it is they're doing. Suddenly, all of them, because Amy was standing at the front of the room with a PowerPoint presentation, everybody stopped and watched her and listened to her and heard what she had to say. It changed everything. So I cannot emphasize enough the value of your student being very vocal and playing as great a role as possible in those meetings. Understand that every one of those meetings, those transition planning meetings, should address 3 primary areas: annual goals, annual assessments, and a coordinated set of activities. Annual goals. We know that our kids are going to change their career goals and their dreams and wants for their life many, many times. It's normal. It's natural. It's part of the growing up process. You know, at 6, they want to be firemen. At 13, they want to be an NBA star. And at 20, hopefully they're kind of honing that in and their goals are more realistic. So every year those should be readdressed and that should be documented. Assessments as well, because they're growing, because they're changing, assessments should be conducted every year. That may or may not include standardized testing. It could, but it may also include informal interviews or discussions with the student. Just sometimes just observations, a teacher or a professional observing students in certain situations or settings and documenting that. There can be lots of ways to assess, but there should be at minimum annual documentation indicating that there's been an update on where your student is, kind of assessing where they are in overall academically, as well as you know, socially and emotionally every year. And then last, the coordinated set of activities. I think oftentimes we being all of us, parents, schools, teachers, everybody sort of sees that as a singular entity. Coordinated set of activities is exactly what it says. Set of activities, meaning multiple. Coordinated set, coordinating multiple activities. And the whole idea behind that was to ensure that as you're sitting down as a team, including the student, including the teachers, ideally including the VR counselor, including the career counselor, anyone who has a role or would have a say and input should be at the table. And everybody should be talking about what kinds of things do we need to be doing to help Johnny or Susie get ready for that big leap from high school into work or college or life. So it could be any number of things. Maybe Susie is timid, kind of shy, hasn't really had any work experience. Her job, her career goals are still kind of unrealistic. And there's some maturity issues. She's kind of behind as it regards maturity. So as a group, with her input, you could plan some things to address that. So maybe there's a club she could become involved in where she participates, maybe has a leadership role. Maybe there's some job shadowing she could be doing. List 3 or 4 different places that are related to her interests where she could go and observe people working. So you see my point, looking for activities throughout the year. And the idea is that there isn't one person responsible for all that. So mom, it isn't you that has to make sure all this happens. There should be a group of people participating. So it should be, yes, possibly the teacher. Maybe it's the person also who runs the clubs. Maybe the career counselor. Maybe mom too. Maybe students. So everybody has a role and everybody's accountable for making sure these kinds of activities are happening to help your student prepare. It's so important. Next slide. So this is something, excuse me, I'm so sorry, that I wanted to make a point of speaking about. Because I think oftentimes we don't have a good understanding of the distinction between IDEA and ADA. Remember, IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It is public school law. The ADA is Americans with Disabilities Act. That is the American Civil Rights Act. So IDEA pertains to school obligations from pre-K through up to the age of 22. So if the student is in school, the IDEA applies. IDEA is an eligibility or an entitlement law, meaning the student is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. meaning the school is responsible for identifying what disabilities the student may have, evaluating them, and determining what those educational needs might be and what supports need to be established. IDEA ensures that students and parents are included in all of the decision making. ADA is not an entitlement law. ADA is an eligibility law. So the point of ADA is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. So what that means is a college and or an employer should not, and in theory, legally cannot discriminate against your child, your student, your son or daughter. But a student must be otherwise eligible or qualified. So a student who wants to go to college has to be eligible for college. And then once deemed eligible, the college has to adhere to ADA mandates. The same with employment. An individual has to be otherwise qualified for that job, must be able to do the essential functions of that job, and then an employer has an obligation to address accommodations. Now, the law is funky. The ADA has lots of great stuff in it, but it also has lots of funky wording. So there, riddled throughout the entire ADA are words like reasonable accommodation, meaning that if it's not reasonable, and who gets to determine that, then the college and or employer doesn't have to provide the accommodation. I will add, though, it is very difficult to prove something is not reasonable. For example, let's say your student is going to college and asking for interpreters and or note takers in class. College says, oh, can't do it. It's too expensive. That's not reasonable. You file an ADA complaint. The first thing the Office of Civil Rights is going to ask that college is, do you send faculty to conferences? Do you have a football team or a soccer team or a volleyball team, and you send them to games? Then you can afford the interpreter. So the argument that it's not reasonable is not a very strong argument in many cases, but know that it's there and it can be used. Next slide. So I've kind of talked about this, entitlement versus eligibility. So just understand that there's a big distinction between public school law, where you can walk in and say, here we are, and the school has to kind of figure it out and work with you, of course, but provide supports and services as needed. ADA is eligibility, meaning you've got to be otherwise qualified, and then they will determine, based on documentation, if you are eligible for supports and services. I hope that makes sense. I guess the negative of a webinar and not seeing your faces is I'm having to guess that what I'm saying is making sense to you, and I can't read your faces and stop and pause, but hopefully I'm making sense. Move on, please. So ADA and employment, a lot of your students, won't be going directly to college. They may be looking at going directly into an employment, and that's perfectly fine. Not everybody shouldn't plan to go to college. Not everybody's meant to go to college. That is certainly an individual choice. But know that when you're seeking employment, there are certain things you want to keep in mind. Self-disclosure is one. Now, if you're a student who is deaf, a candidate and a potential employee who is deaf, it's a little hard to hide that for the obvious reasons. So self-disclosure kind of becomes, in some ways, a non-issue, in that if you are, going into an office and applying for a job and you need to communicate with someone, being deaf is going to be pretty obvious pretty quick. However, if you are applying online, and most jobs now are online, and you choose not to disclose that you are deaf, that is your right. You can apply for a job and not disclose that. Now, obviously, if you're offered an opportunity for an interview, that might be a time to say, well, I'm going to need an interpreter and disclosure might be necessary, but that's a personal choice. Remember that regardless of disability, you must be otherwise qualified and you must be able to do the essential functions of the job. So if you are a person who wants to work in a manufacturing plant and you have applied for a position that requires you to move large packages to shelving, and you have a physical disability, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to lift those boxes, then, and that's the essential part of your job, that's what you're going to be doing most of the time, you would not be considered qualified, otherwise qualified. However, if you are, let's say that same job in that same setting, and on rare occasion you're going to need to lift a box up onto a shelf and you're not able to do that, that would not be considered an essential function. Somebody else can probably lift that box for you. It's not a big deal. You can still do 95% of your job. So the essential functions of the job you're capable of. So hopefully that makes sense. The difference between otherwise qualified, essential functions of the job, versus just assuming you're automatically eligible for something. ADA doesn't work that way. Again, reasonable accommodations, an employer is going to ask you, of course, in an interview setting, what accommodations are needed, in what settings are these accommodations needed. Students, potential employees need to be ready to be able to answer those questions. Accommodations could be, sometimes employers get really worked up over accommodations because that, they're in the business to make money. The first thing they think of is dollar signs. Oh my gosh, how expensive this is going to be. However, oftentimes they're surprised to find out that the accommodation could be as simple as texting back and forth, or using Otter, or using, VRS. All of those things are free. Or there are times when you might need to have an interpreter physically come on site. My daughter has two jobs. She works at a finance company as a data analyst during the day, and she works part-time for Starbucks. So as a data analyst, she has to talk to customers. So she uses VRS and goes through them to access interpreters to communicate with customers all over the country as it relates to their escrows and mortgages and whatever other finance stuff she's doing. And it's worked quite well, and it's costing the company nothing. At Starbucks, it's a little bit different. So for the most part, she goes back and forth with customers, or they write a note to her. If they're having a team meeting and they need to all come together as a group, Starbucks hires an interpreter who physically comes into the site and interprets for her on site. And of course, that costs Starbucks the money, the cost of the interpreter. But, again, a lot of that's about working with people, negotiating, not coming in and demanding your rights, but advocating for your rights, talking about what your needs are and how you can work together to make that happen. Okay, so, and I wanted to add also, during the application process, while an employer cannot ask you specifics about your disability, they can ask you about, are you able to do the essential functions of the job? And they can also ask you to demonstrate how you'd go about doing that job. So, those are some fine lines, if you will, in the employment process. Next slide. I'm covering so much information in such little time. So for those kids going on to college, you can see my daughter graduated at RIT with a bachelor's degree in biomedical science, 2 minors, one in criminal justice and one in psychology. And she started her master's degree, but didn't like it, wasn't happy with it. So she has not completed her master's degree. But in the college search, there's a lot of things you need to be thinking about. Students should be, obviously, kind of aware of what their career goals are going to be. You think that is a silly statement. You'd be, I think some of you at least would be pretty surprised at how many students I worked with when I was in the college setting who did not have even a beginning of a clue. It makes it really hard to work with a student and help, them create a path for coursework and what have you when you don't know kind of where they're at. Undecided is only good for so long. Colleges and universities don't like undecided. Research has shown that when students have a goal, even if it's changed, they have a goal and a path is created, they're more likely to stay in school. So having some sense of what those career goals are. Also, what are your academic areas of interest and strengths? Do you know you're strong in science and math? Amy knew science and math was her go-to. She was very strong in those areas and had a strong interest, especially in science and in research. So she knew that she should choose an institution that had a lot to offer in those areas. Which programs have a history of working with deaf or hard of hearing students? I've asked parents a lot of times when I've chatted with them about this, and I'll say, what do you think if you ask a college or university a simple question, do you work with students who are deaf or hard of hearing? What do you think they'll say? And of course, the answer is yes. They will say yes. Why will they say yes? Because it's illegal to say no. It's illegal not to serve students who are deaf or hard of hearing. So of course they're going to say yes. Asking more just broader questions, asking for what number of students who are deaf or hard of hearing attend your school. So is there a significant mass of students? Is that it's important to your student to have a community? Some students really want that, some students not so much. Do you have staff on board, paid staff working with students who are deaf or hard of hearing? Or do you contract for people from the outside? Meaning, do you have interpreters on staff? Do you have captionists on staff? Or are you hiring from an agency in the community? That tells you a lot about the degree of commitment. And it will tell you oftentimes about the number of students, because typically it's just much more cost effective and makes more sense all around to hire people and have them on college payroll, for all the reasons, commitment to students, commitment to institution, rather than bringing from the outside. But those questions need to be asked. Of course, you want to ask about costs and location. Some institutions are crazy expensive and others are not. In Texas, if you are deaf or hard of hearing and you've been deemed eligible, you can get your tuition waived at any state-run college or university throughout the state of Texas if you are deaf or if you are blind. Student supports. What other accommodations are offered? Will they support all extracurricular activities? If they accept your student, by the way, they're by law required to do that. If they hem-haw around or, aren't giving you really clear examples of that, you might want to ask more questions or look elsewhere. What kind of entrance exams? What kind of criteria is required in order to get into school? A sidebar, most colleges, or many colleges and universities now are not requiring the ACT or the SAT. I would strongly encourage your student to take that test anyway, one of them. Standardized tests are tough, and they certainly are not normed for deaf people, but standardized tests those scores can lead to scholarships, VR support, additional support from the institution you want to go to. So they kind of work in your favor. You want to consider taking those tests regardless. And then, looking at what other entrance criteria is required from that institution's disability services office. Oftentimes we think that if we've applied to the college, if we've been accepted at the college, we're good to go. That is not the case. If you are asking for support services, you will also want to make sure your student has applied within the Disability Services Office. And it might be called a number of different things. It can be Access Office, Student Disability Services Office, I mean, whatever, but look for that office and make sure that your student has applied. And make sure your student has applied well in advance. That's another mistake students make. They think, oh, well, they know I'm here. I'm all good to go. And they can see I'm deaf. Hello, it's not, rocket science. However, if they have not applied and they have not gotten their course schedule and what have you to disability services, then disability services will not have a plan of support services for that student. It is unlikely if you go to that, let's say you show up for class, no interpreters there. Oh my gosh, something's wrong. What am I going to do? You run to the disability office, help, help, help. And they're like, this is the first day of class and we're insane. We're trying to cover everything and everybody. And it's going to be 2 weeks before we can get an interpreter because we didn't know what you were doing. We had no schedule for you, etc. So that's just an example of what can happen. It's very, very important that you become very friendly with your disability services office. Next slide. So within this post-secondary education, there are lots of supports and accommodations that can be provided. Just like employers, if you've been deemed eligible and you've disclosed that you have a disability, which by the way should be a separate process. Remember, you've applied to the college or you've applied for a job that is not part of the disability application process. So when you're applying, once you've done that, you've been accepted to the college, you've been offered an interview for a job, the next step is determining eligibility for services. That's a separate process. And actually in the college university setting, it's against the law for any disability information about students to even be filed in the same place as admissions information. So disability information has to be very separate. It has to be locked up and filed in a completely different office, different place. The two cannot meet. They are very separate processes. And that's to protect the student. Accommodations in the college or university can range from classroom supports, lots of technology supports, of course, dorm room accommodations, but not personal supports. If your student needs assistance with dressing, or I'll give you one of my favorite ones. I was asked many times by parents to go to the dorm and wake up their student every morning for class. I can assure you that is never going to happen, ever. It's just not going to happen. If your student, by the time they have not gotten to college, have not learned how to use a bed shaker or has not had any strategies in place to get themselves up, you've got a problem, NASA. Because the college university, I promise you, is not going to go wake up your student. Now, that student can have a friend wake them up. That student can try to talk the dorm, supervisor into waking them up. It's on them. They can try to figure it out. But chances are their best bet is to have learned and be very comfortable with getting themselves up in the morning while they're in high school and well before they leave the nest. And I know we as parents, I did that. Oftentimes I'd walk in, turn on the light overhead, Amy's bed, and sort of get the day started every morning. And I had to remind myself to stop that. I mean, I had been telling parents that forever, and here I was doing it and said, as of X date, from now on, you're getting yourself up. And if you don't get up, you don't get up. Of course, that meant I was going to pay a price for that, as we all do as parents. But they've got to learn. They just have to have those skills. Some offices are going to offer more than others, depending on the size of the institution you're going to. depending on how well-to-do that institution is, depending on how many students they're supporting. So if a college university has a lot of deaf and hard of hearing students, chances are they've probably created specialized services for that population specifically, tutorial services, maybe orientation sessions, specialized academic counseling, lots of specialized services because they have 30 or 40 or 50 deaf students. NTAD has 12 to 1,500 deaf or hard of hearing students every semester. So they obviously are extremely sophisticated in how they provide services to support all students who are deaf or hard of hearing. But there are many other colleges and universities doing the same thing. So, those are questions to ask for sure. Next slide. Again, examples of supports and accommodations, C-print. If your student is using an interpreter at this time in their high school, that's all great and fine, of course, but they need to be familiar with C-print or CART or TypeWheel, which is a speech to text service, kind of like the captioning that you're seeing if you've got captioning on during this webinar. They need to be familiar with it because there's a great chance that at some point in time, they are going to need to rely on that service as well, whether it be an employment setting or a college setting. Sign language interpreters. Again, oftentimes our kids go to schools or programs where the teachers sign fluently or there's interpreters already provided, and they just assume that magically all this shows up. Not the case. So again, making sure that they understand that they've got to request these services and be clear what kind of sign language service they want. Are they a signed English user? Are they an ASL user? That all of that has to be established with the disability office well in advance. College and universities, pretty much all of them now, of course, require or will provide visual alarms like fire alarms and doorbells, ringers, and what have you. Extended time for tests, extended time for coursework, extended time for homework. These are not unusual accommodations based on your students' needs, depending on their circumstances, can be approved through the Disability Services Office for your student. Maybe your student has a vision loss and large print is appropriate, etc. So my point is, these kinds of things can be requested. You just need to have documentation and supports in place to make sure that you can justify the requests. Things that aren't required. Again, bed shakers, that's a personal need. Colleges are not going to buy your student a bed shaker or an alarm. Now, they may, sometimes if it's a big program, they may have a few that they give their student, they loan. So a student can use them for a few days and or learn how to use one for a couple days till they get one, but that's typically not a service. Personal assistance. So if your student needs assistance with dressing or toileting or eating or anything that's personal in nature, colleges and universities are not mandated to provide that and typically will not provide that. What's important to remember is, again, for all of these things, history of educational need and what was success, what strategies were successful during their public school history. If you've got that documentation, it's gold because you're then able to take that documentation, the IEP planning meeting document, transcripts, the summary, I'm sorry, I'm blocking on the name of the report, the summary of activities at the end of upon graduation of all of those documents. So sorry that I'm blocking on that. All those documents you can take to the Disability Services Office and they will show history of educational need. And oftentimes they won't require any other additional documentation in order to justify providing services within the institution or an employer as well. Next slide. So it's one thing to get into a college or get into a job. It's another thing to stay into college or keep a job. So remembering that there's a lot that's involved, understanding that you've got to realize that you may have remedial coursework that complete. My daughter had a year of remedial coursework she had to do prior to credited coursework. She was not a happy camper, but she needed a lot of support in the area of reading and writing, and she needed that year. So making sure your student understands that so they're not discouraged before they ever really even get started. And understanding how much study time. That was another thing that while I explained to my daughter well in advance, because she's experienced it, didn't fully understand it. It's one thing to be in a class for an hour, but you may be studying and reading for 3 hours for just, and compare in ratio to that 1 hour. Understanding VR expectations. If your student is receiving VR funding and support for college and or for pursuing a job, then VR is going to have expectations. They're going to want, updates on what's going on, how things going, what are your needs, just you need to be in constant communication with the VR counselor. Professor expectations. New students are always shocked that professors are not going to be there to spoon feed them, remind them, give them 3 chances. No, you just because you failed that test doesn't mean you can take it again. No, just because you missed that homework assignment doesn't mean that I'm going to give you 3 more weeks to finish it. It's a new day. College is a new day. So understanding expectations, understanding how to manage their time, that gets them in trouble a lot. So understanding that there's going to be a lot of study time and reading time in addition to, fun time and class time and what have you. Independent living skills and mental health and wellness. This area is probably one of the primary reasons why students don't stay in college and or are not successful in employment. If they don't even know how to wash their own clothes or go buy their own groceries, and many of them go to college or start a job and don't know how to do any of that, they are already stressed with figuring out all that stuff in addition to trying to figure out what's happening academically. It is so important to have these things, have them competent in these areas. My daughter started doing her laundry at the age of 13. I literally never washed another piece of clothing from 13 on. She was on her own. I might help her with, oh, that belongs in that pile, that belongs over here, but otherwise she was on her own. The same with, just ensuring that you're addressing any kind of mental health, mental wellness issues that might be going on. If your student has anxiety, for example, or your student is just excessively timid, lots of students are, and it's okay. But addressing those things, making sure there's supports in place will ensure more success. And knowing how to go get help when things are kind of falling apart. And I've never known a student that didn't have things fall apart at one time or another. It happens. Knowing how to go get help. My daughter for a while was calling me almost daily with one thing or another, but that was okay because I was able to intervene or send her to someone on campus who could assist her, and it prevented a lot of times where she would have been crashing and burning. And we wanted to avoid that. And I would say also making sure you think about how your student can you best use their breaks and summers. What that is such valuable time instead of laying on the couch because what they want to say is, well, I'm exhausted and I need this break. Well, we're all exhausted and a little break is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're also, that's gold time for looking for jobs, for doing volunteer work, for doing charity work, for building a resume for the future. So just thinking about that as, great time for lots of other wonderful activities as well. Next slide. Employer expectations. I would just say, I'm very conscientious of the time here. I would just say that employers will, I've read many surveys and research on employer expectations with potential employees who have disabilities. And without fail, employers will say, we can teach the job. That is not an issue. We don't expect people necessarily to come in with all of the job skills that are needed for that job. What we don't want to teach and are not, prepared to teach are soft skills. And soft skills are those interpersonal skills, social skills, etiquette, the ability to lead a team, simple table manners, technology skills, and even things that are more personality driven, like just innate curiosity, asking for clarification, the ability to kind of ask questions to learn more, in order to learn more about the job. Employers are looking for that. Those are things they can't teach. An employee has to come to them with those things. You think about things like table manners. Well, that's ridiculous. It's not an employer's business if the student knows how to use a fork or not. If your student is working all day full time and is eating in a work, a break room, or they have picnics or anything with other employees, believe me, table manners will matter. Etiquette matters. Your student needs to know how to look someone in the eye, smile politely, shake hands, and say, how are you? A give and take conversation, even if it's rudimentary, very basic. These soft skills will take your student far, regardless of skill sets or, hard skill sets, it will take them far. I have placed individuals who were very, very involved, had very low cognitive skills, and they have been extremely successful on the job because we taught them soft skills, and they were pleasant and just a joy to be around. So last, I want to just touch on pursuit of happiness. Here's Amy. She likes to hike and jog. She's learning how to ski right now. She's moved to Massachusetts and is learning how to ski, and just as an outdoors girl in general. It's important that we also give some focus to this. I think we can become so driven, especially as teachers, as employment and career counselors. We become so busy about preparing them for jobs and college and life that we forget that it's also important to enjoy. So teaching your student, making sure they have hobbies, they know how to play games, they have interests. It can be anything from study. My other daughter, Amy or Joey Lynn, loved whales, and by anything that was ocean related, anything oceanography related. So that was her hobby. She studied the way whales traveled and what have you. She loved all of that. It was an interest that she got joy out of. Look for that so your student is happy, and can be a contributor in things, can be part of something bigger than them. That is as important as being successful in a job and in school, for sure. Goodness. Okay, the hour is over and I have ripped through this like nobody's business. So if we can, I've got, I think, about a minute left. If we can open it up. Interpreters, I so apologize. You probably are going to have to put ice on your hands at this point. But if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, we'd love for everybody, if you do have a question, you can stick it there in the chat box, or you can turn on your camera and share the question or comment with Theresa.
Their heads are spinning.
This is great information. This is excellent information. I know that people are probably processing this. I know people are taking notes. I've seen some of the people here, heads up and down writing things. So this was incredible information. We thank you, Theresa, for sharing not only your professional journey, but your personal one as a parent. That is very valuable information. The last slide included Theresa's contact information. So if you do have any questions and would like to reach out to her, you can do so. I will be sending a copy of this presentation as a follow-up from the webinar, so you can expect to get that here shortly. If there is a colleague or a fellow parent that you think could benefit from this information, the recording will be on our YouTube channel in the next day or two. It takes a little while to upload that, but we invite you to share that with your community as well. We hope that if you need anything else, you know where to find Texas Hands and Voices. You can find us at txhv.org, and all of our contact information is there as well. We also want to remind you that our next Lunch and Learn webinar will be on July 17th with the Texas Education Agency, and they will be providing us with some updates. So thank you guys for joining us, and we hope to see you all next month. Thank you, everyone.